As the most recognizable and iconic character within Marvel's stable of heroes, Spider-Man is probably the one who winds up in the most team-ups out of all of them. As such, some of these partnerships have wound up being a few of the most hyped moments in all of comics. Others, however, have wound up being a little bit out of left field, a bit unexpected. In this video, I'm going to take you through some of the most bizarre and absurd team-ups, along with some of the most unpredictably cool, all in hopes of shedding some light on some of the stranger parts of Spider-Man's comic history. So sit back and relax, and let's go ahead and dive right into it. Imagine for a moment, what would happen if Marvel and DC were able to put aside their multiple decades of rivalry within the comic book space and team up some of their most iconic characters for one massive comic story? Well, you don't really have to imagine, as this has actually happened a few different times. Such as one instance in 1976, when everyone's favorite friendly neighborhood Spider-Man was put head-to-head against the Man of Steel himself, Superman. This comic saw Lex Luthor meeting, and then subsequently teaming up with Dr. Octopus, hoping to hatch a plan to trick Spider-Man into fighting Superman by having an imposter Superman kidnap Mary Jane and Lois Lane. While the plan was successful, leading to the quote-unquote Battle of the Century, as it was dubbed by the publishers, the two heroes very quickly recognized the ruse and wound up working together to try to stop Lex and Oc's plans. Despite how awesome seeing these two comic book titans working side by side is, this comic sometimes confuses comic purists, as there is literally zero explanation given as to how these two seem to exist in the same world together, not giving us a single moment where either of them cross over universes or anything like that. And that is simply because it doesn't take place in either the Marvel 616 world or DC's Prime Earth. It actually takes place in the rarely used crossover Earth, designated Earth 7642 by Marvel. Basically, it's a fancy way of saying that this story is non-canon for both heroes, but it's still pretty awesome regardless, though it might just suffer from a bit too much of the colors red and blue. What I wouldn't give to get a crossover between Spider-Man and a character with a much darker color palette. Oh hey, would you look at that? Seems I got my wish. Back in 1995, when Spider-Man met up with the Dark Knight, Batman. Taking place once again in the Earth 7642 continuity, this story saw Batman and the Webhead teaming up in order to take on the combined might of Joker and Carnage, which might honestly be one of the most terrifying combinations of villains I've ever heard of. Seriously, the combination of Joker's love for mindless violence and Carnage's almost obsessive need for murder is horrific. So much potential for mayhem. That is, of course, if the two were actually able to get along. Carnage and Joker spend the majority of the story fighting each other. Even in the final moments, when Carnage had the upper hand over Batman and could have ended him once and for all, Joker instead stopped him, stating that if anyone was gonna kill the Bat, it was gonna be him. So between the two villains not really being able to work together effectively and a team up of two of comics' greatest heroes, things ended relatively smoothly. Beyond that, Marvel and DC would team up a few more times over the years, having the Justice League go up against the Avengers on a couple of occasions, and introducing fans everywhere to the Amalgam Comics universe, a short-lived series of comics that combine elements of both universes, giving us characters such as Iron Lantern, Darkclaw, Super Soldier, and of course, Spider-Boy. So I guess Marvel and DC working together isn't the craziest thing after all. That being said, don't expect any team-ups like this on the big screen anytime soon if I had to venture a guess. That's less down to the rivalry between the two comic companies and more about the rivalry between Disney and Warner Brothers. But I'll save the discussion about studio politics for Screen Rant. Say what you will about the state of modern Saturday Night Live, but I doubt anyone would argue against the statement that during the late 1970s, the show had one of the best casts in comedy history. I'm talking about comedians who are still to this day some of the best in the industry. And apparently, they are so good that they even managed to take on a supervillain at one point. In Marvel Team-Up number 74, Peter Parker and Mary Jane went on a date to a taping of Saturday Night Live, and wound up mixed up in a confrontation with the Silver Samurai. While all this was going on, the cast of SNL at the time, including Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi, Bill Murray, Jane Curtin, Garrett Morris, Lorraine Newman, and Gilda Radner all encountered Samurai's thugs, and all fared relatively well against them, all things considered. This all culminated in a one-on-one battle between Belushi, who at the time was dressed up in a samurai costume, and the Silver Samurai himself, though Silver Samurai did technically win out in the end. Due to licensing rights and whatnot, this particular issue of Team Up hasn't been reprinted. But if you manage to track down a copy, or find somewhere online that you can read it, I'd recommend it, if for no other reason than to see the kind of absurdity that can only occur when you mix 70s era Marvel with comedy greats. Speaking of comedy greats, Ren and Stimpy is one of those shows where you either love it, hate it, or have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. When it was on the air, there was nothing else like it out there, and fans flocked to it for its unique style and sense of humor. Its popularity caused it to become big enough that Marvel soon started producing a comic series based on the show. It was usually just more of the same from the franchise. However, in issue 6, we got something truly bizarre. Something that could only happen due to this business relationship between the show and the comic giant. In that issue, we got to see Spider-Man face off against the aptly named Powdered Toast Man, in a battle that no one asked for. Seriously, that's what it said on the cover. This gave us some really out there moments, such as when Spidey showed us the 102nd use for his webbing, which is apparently for generating blue and red French toast slices that just don't taste very good. And of course there was the expected fight between the webhead and the superpowered breakfast food, which, like any good superhero versus story, ultimately led to the two teaming up to take down the true villain of the story. This is about as out there as team-ups come, which is probably why it only happened once, as after this, Spidey steered clear of the Ren and Stimpy universe. Probably for the best, honestly. Now that we've gotten through all of the really weird team-up Spider-Man has had with people outside of the main Marvel universe, let's instead shift our focus over to some of the most unexpected pairings that we have between the wall crawler and actual Marvel characters, shall we? Now, in most cases, seeing Spider-Man working alongside Daredevil or Moon Knight wouldn't really be that bizarre. After all, they all fit the street-level hero designation pretty comfortably, as well as the fact that they all operate usually within New York City. So needless to say, they've probably ran into each other in the past. What makes this specific team-up so odd is who the three of them were fighting against. The Ringmaster, a circus-themed villain, has always been treated as a bit of a laughingstock. All he has going for him is a pink top hat that can sometimes be used to hypnotize people. Needless to say, he isn't exactly difficult for even the most underpowered hero to take down. However, once he got a hold of a cosmic cube ring, suddenly, no one was laughing. Utilizing his newly acquired unlimited power, he quickly managed to trap the three heroes, and he was nearly able to finish them off. However, he was rather indecisive about how he wanted to go about it, and his hesitation gave the Punisher just enough time to show up and shoot his finger off, removing the ring of power and reducing him to his regular, pathetic state. Unsurprisingly, this is one team-up that the three heroes would rather just forget about, as none of them probably want to remember the time that they were almost taken out permanently by a walking punchline. Can't really say that I blame them on that one. Have you ever heard of the classic superhero, the Fabulous Frogman, who graced the pages of Marvel Comics, starting with his first appearance in issue 121 of Marvel Team Up in 1982? No? But the dude is iconic! Okay, not really. He's a bit of a joke, but at least he tries. Eugene Patillo's father, Vincent, was always a bit of a loser. An inventor who never managed to actually invent anything of note, he struggled to support his small family. That is, until his wife passed away, and he was forced to come up with some way to make money. Which he did, by becoming the leaping small-time criminal called Leapfrog, donning a suit featuring leaping coils that allowed him to clear roughly 6 stories in a single jump. However, he was even a loser as a criminal as well, as he quickly wound up in prison. Seeking to get out from under the shadows of his father's failures, Eugene took his father's frog suit and attempted to instead fight crime, becoming the Fabulous Frogman. From there, the guy wound up teaming up with quite a few Marvel heroes, including Spider-Man, though these impromptu partnerships were almost always more the heroes swooping in to save him than true team-ups. His heart was in the right place though, as he genuinely tried to help people. So in that regard, Spider-Man never really looked down on what the guy was doing. He was just more of an inconvenience than anything. Frogman wasn't the only youngster who tried his hardest to be a hero, despite not exactly being good at it. Ollie Osnick started out his path towards herodom as an admirer of a supervillain. As a big fan of Dr. Octopus, Ollie set out to emulate his favorite bad guy and wound up designing and building his own set of robotic arms. However, after a very minor confrontation between this Kid Ock and Spider-Man, who had mistaken Ollie for the real Ock, Ollie was so impressed by Spidey that he modified his arms, donned a cheap Spider-Man Halloween costume, and set out to instead mimic the Wallcrawler, taking on the name of Spider-Kid. Like Frogman, Spider-Kid's intentions were there, but his skill set, not so much. However, that didn't stop Spider-Man, who had taken a bit of a shine to the lad, from suggesting to him that he team up with Frogman and the mutant Toad to form a super team called the Misfits. Obviously, this low-powered team didn't exactly last long, leading to Ollie hanging up his spider suit and robotic arms, once again becoming a normal kid. At least until the events following the Civil War story arc, where he briefly came out of retirement. However, that's a story for another video entirely. You know, I understand Spider-Man having a bit of a soft spot for all these young kids trying to be heroes, as he himself started his superhero career at a fairly young age. But when you think about it, him encouraging them to continue trying is just a bit reckless of him. You'd think he'd know better, but apparently he doesn't. At this point, pretty much everyone knows who Howard the Duck is. He's an anthropomorphic, foul-mouthed duck who likes to drink and smoke cigars. So not exactly the kind of character you'd imagine seeing running around with the more kid-friendly Spider-Man. And for the most part, that's pretty accurate. However, that was until Marvel Team-Up number 96. In this issue, Howard, who was at the time serving as a taxi driver in New York City, met Spider-Man for the first time as they teamed up to take on Status Quo. Status Quo, a villain who sought to end all fads, destroying anything that's trendy. And yeah, it's just as ridiculous as it sounds. Let's just say that there's a reason why this issue was this guy's one and only appearance. Despite having an absolutely absurd final goal, Status Quo somehow managed to amass quite the following, which drew the attention of Spider-Man, who, along with Howard, confronted Status Quo and pointed out the hypocrisy of his current situation. As someone who sought to destroy all fads, he himself had become somewhat of a fad, meaning that if he actually wanted to end everything trendy, he'd probably have to end himself. And it kinda worked. As I mentioned, he never came back in any other comics, so I guess he took all of that to heart. Didn't make the pairing of Howard the Duck and Spider-Man any less weird though. That being said, since both of them are in the MCU, how long before we get the inevitable film adaptation of this story? Probably gonna be waiting a while on that one. Just guessing. Admittedly, these days, seeing Spider-Man and Venom working together is kind of old hat. Nothing about it is all that exciting or really unexpected at all. However, when you think about this pairing within the context of the time in which it first happened, you can begin to understand why this particular team-up has made its way onto this list. These are two characters who, since Venom's introduction, have completely loathed each other, with Venom spending nearly his entire time in the comics just trying to take Spidey out permanently. That was seemingly his one purpose in life. However, once Carnage entered the picture, suddenly these two once enemies had reason to put their hatred for each other aside, all to try to stop a much more horrific threat. The red symbiote offspring of Venom bonded with a serial killer. From Maximum Carnage onward, the two still faced off against each other more often than not, but Venom began his journey towards becoming less of a villain and more of an anti-hero, which in turn led to more team-ups between the pair. So it might not be anything all that out of the ordinary these days, but in the 90s, it was certainly a pretty hyped pairing. It's one thing to team up with a villain who's been around for only a few years. It's another thing entirely to team up with someone who has been considered your arch nemesis for decades. There is arguably no one Peter Parker hates more in all of comics than Norman Osborn, especially since the death of Gwen Stacy at the hands of the Goblin. Since then, Parker has been pretty much all business when it comes to Green Goblin, even often dropping his witty banter in order to try to focus on taking him down. However, the two were able to temporarily put aside their animosity for each other in Spider-Man number 95. In this issue, Norman, his grandson, Parker, and Betty Brant found themselves in a life or death situation when the villain Nitro blew up the elevator they were in. In order to survive, the two men worked together to find a way out of the situation. It was a rather ghastly situation to be in, and probably one of the most intense team-ups Spider-Man has ever been a part of, which is definitely saying something considering his comic history. Hey there everybody, I'm John Aljets. I made this video, and I want to know what you think. Which of these team-ups did you find to be the most out of left field? Let me know in the comments below or shoot me a response over on Twitter. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching and be sure to subscribe to CBR for more great videos just like this in the future.